The night a child was chained to a tree in the Tennessee hills, the temperature had already dropped below freezing. No houses for miles. No lights except the cold scatter of stars above the tree line. And then, a single headlight cutting through the dark like a blade. What the writer found at the end of that beam wasn't something a person forgets. Not in this life. Not in any life after. An 8-year-old girl, barefoot, wrists raw from chain links, bruises older than the ones you could see, and eyes that had already learned the most dangerous lesson a child should never have to learn, that the people who are supposed to love you are capable of the worst things in the world. The biker who cut that chain wasn't looking for purpose. He wasn't looking for anything. But some roads find you whether you want them to or not. If you've ever believed that the most broken people sometimes become the most ferocious protectors, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. The highway through Harlan County didn't show up on most maps anymore. It had been repaved exactly once in 30 years, patched in places with cold asphalt that buckled and heaved every winter, and lined on both sides by black oak and white pine so dense the tree line swallowed the shoulders whole. Locals called it the Widow Road, though nobody living could agree on exactly why. Some said it was the deer that crossed at night without warning. Some said it was the curves. Knox Ryder had driven it enough times to know the truth was simpler than that. It was just a road that didn't care whether you made it to the other end. He was running low on reasons to care about that himself. The Harley ran clean beneath him. A '94 Softail he'd rebuilt twice with his own hands. The engine tuned so tight he could feel every cylinder firing through the frame and up into his spine. That was the thing about motorcycles that most people never understood. You didn't ride one so much as wear it. Every crack in the road translated directly into your body. Every gust of wind was a negotiation between momentum and collapse. There was no padding between you and the world when you were on a bike, which was exactly why Knox had spent the last 4 years riding every chance he got. The world's indifference felt more honest when it was pressing against your chest at 60 miles an hour and 17 degrees Fahrenheit. November in the Tennessee Hill Country meant darkness by 5 o'clock and cold that had teeth. He'd left Clarkson before sundown with no particular destination in mind, wearing the same thing he always wore. Worn Levi's, a thermal undershirt under a flannel, the old black leather cut that had so many miles in it, the patches had started to peel at the edges. His exhale made small clouds that the wind tore apart before they could form shapes. The pines on either side of the Widow Road stood absolutely still. No deer, no cars, no sounds except the engine and the distant whistle of wind moving through the high ridgeline above. He'd been riding for going on 2 hours when the Softail's headlight swept across something that stopped his blood cold. Knox didn't brake hard. He'd been in enough situations where hard braking got you killed to have trained himself against the instinct. He decelerated steadily, swung wide, brought the bike to a stop on the gravel shoulder with the engine still running, and just sat there for a moment with his hand on the throttle, staring at what the headlight was showing him. An oak tree. Ancient thing, trunk wider than 3 men standing side by side, bark like armor. It sat at the edge of the tree line 12 feet off the road, and it was impossible to say at first what was wrong with the picture, except that something obviously was, the way your eye catches a wrong note before your brain can name the key. Then his eyes adjusted and his brain caught up, and the wrongness resolved into something specific and terrible. A chain. Heavy gauge. The kind used to anchor equipment or lock up serious machinery. Wrapped twice around the base of the tree and secured with a padlock the size of a fist. And at the end of that chain, half hidden in the shadow where the headlight beam narrowed to almost nothing, was something small. Something that breathed. Knox was off the bike before he fully decided to move. He crossed the shoulder and the strip of dead grass between the road and the tree line in maybe 6 strides. His boots loud on the frozen ground, and he still didn't fully believe what he was seeing until he was close enough to crouch down and bring his face level with it. A child. A little girl. 8 years old, maybe 9, small and slight in a way that suggested either age or hunger, or both. She was wearing what had once been a light cotton dress, pale blue, now gray with cold and filth, and nothing on her feet. Nothing on her feet. Her toes were so cold they'd stopped being pink and gone to a color that made Knox's stomach turn over hard. The chain was attached to a metal cuff around her ankle, old-fashioned and heavy. The skin beneath it rubbed raw to the point of bleeding in places. She was awake. That was the first thing. Her eyes were open, tracking him, dark and enormous, in a face that had been pretty before someone had put 3 separate bruises on it. She didn't cry when he crouched in front of her. She didn't make any sound at all. She just watched him with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that moving or making noise brings consequences. That stillness was the worst thing Knox Ryder had ever seen. He'd done 2 tours in Fallujah. He'd seen the specific things combat does to human bodies and the specific things it does to the minds of men who come home afterward. He'd seen friends disappear into bottles and pills and the quiet catastrophes of ordinary life. He'd lost a brother, not blood but close enough, to a roadside device outside Ramadi in 2006, and he'd spent the next decade and a half carrying the weight of a grief he'd never properly learned to set down. He thought he'd seen the full range of what people were capable of doing to each other. He thought he'd absorbed enough of it to have stopped being surprised. The child's stillness surprised him. He kept his voice quiet and his hands visible, and he said, "Hey, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to get you loose, all right? You just stay still." She didn't answer, but something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, not even close to trust yet, but a flicker of assessment. She was deciding something about him. Knox understood that. He stayed crouched and kept his hands slow, and pulled out the folding knife he kept clipped to his belt, opening it with one hand while he examined the chain. The padlock was serious hardware, not something the knife would touch. He looked at the chain itself. Thick gauge, but old, and there was a link near the cuff end that had started to fatigue, a hairline crack barely visible in the headlight glow. He stood up and went back to the bike without saying anything, and pulled the tool roll from the saddlebag and came back with the small bolt cutters he kept for emergencies he'd never quite been able to specify in advance. He positioned the jaws on the fatigued link and bore down hard. It took 3 attempts. On the third, the link split with a sound like a gunshot in the frozen quiet, and the chain fell away from the cuff, and the little girl made a single sharp sound, not a word, more like a breath, and then went silent again. Knox cut the cuff off with more careful work, the blade finding the softer inner band, and when the metal fell away from her ankle, he saw the full extent of the damage to the skin underneath, and had to breathe carefully through his nose for a moment to keep his face neutral. He didn't want her to see his reaction. She'd seen enough of other people's reactions to her pain, and none of them had been good. He took off the leather cut and wrapped it around her in one motion, lifting her as he stood. She was lighter than she should have been. That registered somewhere in his chest as a specific and burning kind of anger that he banked carefully, because anger wasn't what she needed right now, and he knew it. What she needed was warmth, and he was going to get her that before anything else. "What's your name?" he said. She didn't answer for a long moment. He was already moving toward the bike, carrying her, adjusting his grip so she was cradled against his chest and could feel body heat. Then, quiet as a dropped thread, "Lila." "Lila," he said. "I'm Knox. You're not out here alone anymore." He pulled out his phone and got 1 bar of signal, which was 1 more than he usually had on the Widow Road, and made a call that rang 4 times before a rough voice answered with a single word. "Yeah." "Diesel," Knox said. "I need the safe house. I'm coming in with a kid." Silence on the other end. Not shocked silence. The men Knox rode with had learned to absorb hard news without visible reaction, but the particular silence of someone recalibrating quickly. Then, "How bad?" "Bad enough," Knox said. "Have Mara pull out the medical kit. Have someone start coffee. And don't ask me questions yet because I don't have answers yet." "Copy," Diesel said, and the line went dead. Knox looked down at Lila. She was watching him with those enormous dark eyes, the leather cut pulled tight around her shoulders, and she was shivering so hard her teeth had begun to knock together. He zipped her inside the front of his flannel shirt as best he could and kicked the soft tail to life and turned back toward Clarkson. The cold hit him full in the face the moment he accelerated, without the cut to buffer it, but that particular discomfort barely registered. He had a child's heartbeat against his chest and a 16-mile ride ahead of him, and he focused on that and nothing else. The Black Horizon Brotherhood safe house sat at the end of a logging road off Route 44, a converted farmhouse that had been falling apart gracefully for about 40 years before Diesel bought it from a bank auction for less than the cost of a used pickup truck. It was 3 stories of drafty wood and failing plaster, and a furnace that ran on propane and stubbornness, and it was warm. That was the primary and essential thing about it. It was warm, and it was off the grid, and the only people who knew it existed were people who had earned the knowledge. Diesel met him on the porch, real name Thomas Garrett, though nobody had called him that since the Army. 6'4", 230 pounds, skin the color of dark walnut, and a beard that had gone silver at the edges. He'd done 3 tours with the 82nd Airborne and come home with a knee that would never be entirely right, and a set of memories he managed through carpentry and motorcycle maintenance and the deliberate absence of certain conversations. He was, in Knox's experience, one of the most reliably calm human beings on the planet. He looked at the child wrapped in Knox's cut, and his jaw tightened, and he stepped back from the door without a word. Inside, the front room was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke. The furnace knocked and hissed in the back hallway. 3 other men were already there. Cage, who was 28, and the youngest of them, with a dislocated shoulder that had healed wrong and a permanent slight list to his left side. Prophet, who was 45 and had been a medic in the Marine Corps, and now ran a very quiet and very useful informal medical practice out of the farmhouse's back bedroom. And a man everyone called simply Wren, who had not explained where he'd come from or what he'd left behind and whose specific competencies had made the question unnecessary. They were all standing. They all went still when Knox came through the door with Lila. Prophet moved first. That was his training. He crossed the room in 4 steps, crouched in front of Knox and Lila, and said, "Hey, sweetheart, I'm going to take a look at your feet, all right? I used to be a medic. I know exactly how to fix cold toes. That okay with you?" Lila looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Knox. "He's all right," Knox said. She looked at Prophet again and gave a single slow nod, and something in the room exhaled. They set her up on the old couch nearest the furnace with blankets and a mug of warm broth that Cage produced from somewhere without being asked, and Prophet worked on her feet with quiet professionalism, and the rest of them gathered in the kitchen doorway and spoke in low voices. Knox told them what he'd found and where. He told them about the chain and the cuff and the bruises and the bare feet. He didn't editorialize. The facts were sufficient. He watched the faces of his brothers take in those facts and do the same thing he'd done on the Widow Road. Absorb, recalibrate, contain. Diesel's hand found the counter behind him and gripped it. Cage looked at the floor. Wren's expression didn't change, but his eyes went somewhere specific and cold. "She say anything?" Diesel asked. "Her name," Knox said. "That's it so far." "Did she say who put her there?" "No." Knox paused. "I didn't push. She's not going to tell us anything tonight except what she decides she wants to tell us. Pushing her will just shut her down." Diesel nodded. "So tonight we get her warm and fed and safe," Knox said. "Everything else waits." They were good at waiting. That was one of the things combat veterans were genuinely good at, Knox had found. The particular discipline of sitting with the immediate problem and not borrowing tomorrow's catastrophe before you had to. You got through the current 10 minutes, then the next 10. You didn't solve the whole war in a single night. You kept the person in front of you alive until morning, and then you figured out what morning required. Mara arrived at close to midnight. She wasn't brotherhood, not in the formal sense, but she was family in every way that mattered. She was Diesel's cousin, a 40-year-old ER nurse from Clarkson General who had patched up more of them more times than any of them liked to count, and who kept a bag in the back of her truck at all times for exactly this category of situation. She looked at Lila for about 30 seconds, and then she looked at Knox, and her face held all the things he wasn't letting himself feel yet. "She's going to be okay," Mara said quietly. "Frostbite risk on 3 toes, but Prophet caught it in time. The bruising is old. Some of it's very old." She paused. "She's been through this for a while." Knox said nothing. "Knox!" Mara touched his arm. "You saved her life tonight. If the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees..." She stopped. "You saved her life." He nodded. But he wasn't thinking about the saving. He was thinking about the chain. about the specific weight and gauge of it, about the padlock, about the fact that someone had chosen that spot deliberately, far enough off the main route that no casual driver would have swung their headlights across the tree line, accessible enough to get a child there. Whoever had done this had done it with thought and intention. That meant it wasn't the first time, and it meant there was a specific person who had decided a child was something that could be chained to a tree like equipment. That thought lived in his chest for the rest of the night, like a coal. Lila slept eventually. Not easily. She startled twice in the first hour, and once made a sharp sound that brought Mara off the chair beside her in an instant. But she slept. Knox sat in the kitchen and drank bad coffee and didn't sleep at all. Diesel sat across from him for a while without speaking, which was the correct response, and then at some point produced a bottle of bourbon that neither of them touched. "You're going to find out who did this," Diesel said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Knox said. "And then?" "I don't know yet." He was being honest. The anger was still banked and contained, and he didn't entirely trust what it wanted to be yet. "First, I need to know more." More came in pieces over the following 3 days. Lila didn't open up the way children in movies opened up. Not in a single conversation, not at a particular emotional turning point, not in response to any specific gesture of kindness. She opened up the way real children did after real trauma. Sideways. In fragments. She would say something matter-of-fact and devastating while watching Cage fix a carburetor, or she would answer a question Knox hadn't asked while Mara was braiding her hair. Or she would stare at something across the room and say a single sentence and then go quiet again for hours. The picture she built was jagged and incomplete, like a photograph torn and partly reassembled, with whole sections still missing. Her name was Lila Hart. She was 8 years old. Her mother was Evelyn Hart. They had lived in 3 different places in the last 2 years, always moving, always starting over, and the man they'd been running from had always found them. The man's name was Trent Holloway. He was Evelyn's husband, or had been, or still was. The legal specifics seemed unclear to Lila. And he was a specific kind of dangerous that Lila understood from direct experience rather than abstract concept. He had a way of being very calm when he was most frightening. He had a way of explaining things that made Lila feel like the terrible things happening were somehow caused by her own failures. He had hit Evelyn in places that didn't show. He had hit Lila in places that did show when it suited him, usually as a communication to Evelyn about the consequences of non-compliance. On the day Lila had ended up on the Widow Road, Evelyn had tried to run again. They'd gotten as far as the car before Trent caught them. What happened after that was something Lila told in 3 words, and a silence. He took Mama. Knox's hands were flat on the kitchen table when she said that. He was aware of them. He was aware of the precise pressure required to keep them flat instead of doing anything else. "Where did he take her?" he asked. "The place with the gate," Lila said. She was eating a bowl of oatmeal with an expression of complete concentration, as though the eating required her full attention. "The big house with the gate. Trent goes there a lot. He calls the man there Sir." She looked up at Knox. "Trent is scared of him. I could always tell. Trent is only scared of one person." Knox looked at Diesel across the table. Diesel's eyes were steady and dark and thinking. The name Victor Graves came to them not from Lila but from Wren, who had gone quiet for about 48 hours after Lila's arrival, and then walked into the kitchen one morning with a cup of coffee and a single piece of information delivered in the same tone you'd use to read a weather forecast. "Holloway works for Victor Graves," Wren said. "Graves runs protection, distribution, and county officials across 4 jurisdictions in this part of the state. He has a compound outside Mercier, about 30 miles east. Fenced, gated, security on rotation. He's been operational for going on 20 years without a serious legal interruption." He drank his coffee. "Holloway is mid-level. He handles asset protection and enforcement. One of those assets apparently is the woman." Nobody asked Wren how he knew this. That fell under the category of questions that didn't need answering. "Victor Graves," Knox said, repeating the name slowly, the way you'd turn over an object in your hands to find the weight of it. Something moved at the back of his memory, dull and distant, the way old injuries ached when the weather changed. He couldn't locate it. He let it go. "We can't go at the compound directly," Diesel said. "Not with what we have. not against his security structure. "I'm not talking about going at the compound," Knox said. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about finding Evelyn first, before Graves decides she's more liability than asset." He paused. "And I'm talking about keeping Lila exactly where she is until we understand the full picture. Because something about this is wrong." "Wrong how?" Knox thought about the Widow Road, about the headlight catching the chain at exactly the right angle, about the single bar of signal he'd had when he'd needed it, about the too specific set of circumstances that had placed him, and not someone else, at that particular bend of road at that particular hour. "Wrong like it was planned," he said quietly. Nobody spoke for a moment. The furnace knocked. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like running water. "You think Lila was put there deliberately?" Diesel said. "I think it's possible." "To what end?" "That's what I don't know yet," Knox said, "and I don't like not knowing. It was Cage who first noticed the locket. He wasn't looking for it. He'd been sitting with Lila while she watched the small television in the front room, a nature documentary about bears that she'd requested with the specific seriousness of a child who had identified something important and needed to study it. Cage was whittling something shapeless from a piece of pine, which was the thing he did when sitting still became difficult, and Lila had fallen asleep against his uninjured shoulder, and the locket had shifted in her sleep and fallen outside the collar of the borrowed sweatshirt she was wearing. Cage called Knox in from the kitchen with a look rather than a word. Knox crouched beside the sleeping child and looked at the locket without touching it. It was small and oval, gold or gold-colored, worn smooth from handling. An old thing, a kept thing, the kind of object a person hangs on to not for monetary value, but because it represents something that couldn't be replaced. He could see from the condition of the chain that it had been worn constantly for a long time, that it had survived everything Lila had survived because someone had made sure it did. He didn't open it that night. That felt like a violation, the locket asleep with its owner. But he thought about it. He thought about it all the way through the rest of that night and into the following morning, when Lila woke up and ate 2 pieces of toast and 3 scrambled eggs, and then sat at the kitchen table and looked at Knox with her serious dark eyes and said, "Mama told me if I ever found the right person, I should show them what's inside." Knox went very still. "The locket?" he said. Lila reached up and unclasped it herself and placed it open on the table between them. Inside, on one side, was a small color photograph, faded at the edges from age and probably from being opened so many times. A man, younger than Knox by maybe 15 years, Knox's current years rather, meaning the man in the photograph was about 30, wearing civilian clothes, standing beside a motorcycle in what looked like a parking lot. Dark hair, a jaw that could have been cut from the same rough stone, and a specific scar at the left temple that Knox's own fingers knew from touch. The photograph was of him. The kitchen went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Knox picked up the locket with hands that were not quite steady and looked at the photograph for a long time. Diesel was behind him. He could feel it rather than see it, the specific weight of his brother's attention. Nobody said anything. The furnace ticked. Outside, a crow landed on the porch railing and screamed once and flew off. "Where did your mother get this, what?" Knox said. His voice came out steadier than it had any right to. "She said a man saved her life a long time ago," Lila said. "She was watching him carefully. Before I was born. She said she never forgot him. She said she kept the picture so that if he ever found us, she'd know it was the right person." A pause. "She said the universe would send him when she needed him most." Knox set the locket down. He pressed his hands flat on the table and breathed very carefully and deliberately for a moment. The way you breathed when something seismic had shifted underneath you and you needed to reestablish your own coordinates. He had no memory of the incident. That was the maddening and nauseating thing. He'd been in his late 20s then, early 30s at most, given the math, given Lila's age, and he'd been doing the kind of writing and the kind of living that had produced a lot of incidents, most of them compressed now into general impressions rather than specific memories. He'd been doing a stretch of work for a bail bondsman in those years, finding people, sometimes extracting them from situations, the work the Brotherhood occasionally took on when the need was clear and the law was not going to help. He'd pulled people out of a lot of situations. He hadn't always known their names. He hadn't always known what became of them after. "Do you know what your mother's name was?" he asked Lila. "Her name before Holloway? Her maiden name?" Lila thought about it. "Hart," she said. She said she kept her name when she married Trent because she didn't want to be a Holloway. Knox sat with that. Evelyn Hart. The name didn't pull up anything specific, but something else did. A cold night, a decade and a half ago, maybe more, and a woman with dark hair and a split lip, and eyes that had the same particular expression as the ones looking at him across the table right now. He hadn't known her name. He hadn't asked. He'd gotten her out of a situation and put her in a cab and gone back to whatever he'd been doing. He hadn't known her name, but Victor Graves had known his. "Knox," Diesel said from behind him. Very quiet. "Knox, look at me." Knox turned. Diesel's face was doing something carefully controlled, the way it did when he was containing something large. "If Graves has known about you since then," Diesel said, "and if Holloway is Graves' man, then Lila wasn't abandoned," Knox said. "She was placed." The word landed in the room like something heavy dropped from height. Placed. Not left in a moment of rage or desperation, not abandoned in a panic. Positioned. Calculated. A child chained to a tree on a road Knox used because someone who'd been watching long enough to know his routes had decided it was time to activate something. What began as a rescue hadn't been a rescue. Or it had, but it had also been a summons. 19 years in the making, long patient, cold-blooded. A message delivered in the body of an 8-year-old girl. Knox thought about the padlock, about the fatigued link, about the single bar of signal. Someone had wanted him to get her free. Someone had wanted him to have what he needed to make the call to bring her here. Someone had engineered the exact conditions for him to be standing in this kitchen right now, knowing what he now knew, with exactly this fury building inside him. And the woman at the center of it, Evelyn Hart, Lila's mother, was still inside that compound with the gate. "He wanted you to find her," Cage said from the doorway. The young man's voice was flat and certain. "Graves. He wanted you to find Lila. That's the only read that fits." Knox nodded slowly. "Why?" Mara said. She had come in sometime in the last few minutes, her voice careful. "If he wanted to hurt Knox, why not just—" "Because this is better," Wren said. He was leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his coffee cup long empty. "Graves has been in this game for 20 years. Men who stay in for 20 years don't operate simply. They operate elaborately." He looked at Knox. "He doesn't want to hurt you. He wants to pull you into something you can't walk back from. He wants you to come at him, on his terms, his ground, his timeline. He wants to finish something," Knox said. "He wants you to lose something," Wren said. "I think there's a difference." The room sat with that. Outside, the wind picked up, and the pines shook their branches, and somewhere on the ridge a bird screamed and went silent. Lila had gotten down from her chair at some point during this conversation. Nobody had noticed when, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding the locket closed in both hands, watching Knox with those ancient 8-year-old eyes. "She's still there," Lila said. "Mama, she's still in that place." Nobody told her she was wrong. Nobody tried to soften what that meant. Knox looked at the child who had been positioned like a chess piece on a frozen road. He looked at the photograph of his younger self inside that locket, kept all those years, kept through everything, by a woman he couldn't remember who had apparently never stopped believing he was worth remembering. He thought about the chain, the weight of it, the specific cruelty of that choice, of all the ways to confine a person, and the particular one selected. He thought about Evelyn Hart sitting in a room somewhere in that gated compound 30 miles east of where they were standing, waiting for something she might not even be sure was still possible. He thought about 19 years, about all the miles and all the quiet and all the deliberate emptiness he'd put between himself and anything that required him to feel the full weight of what he'd become and what he'd lost. He'd been riding the Widow Road looking for nothing. That was what he'd told himself. That was the story he'd given the empty miles, looking for nothing, expecting nothing, owed nothing, and owing nothing in return. But someone had known exactly what road he'd be on and exactly what he'd do when his headlight caught the right piece of steel. And the worst part, the part that had been sitting in his chest since the moment he'd looked at that photograph was that the person who knew him best in this situation wasn't his brothers, wasn't Mara, wasn't anyone in this room. It was a man who wanted to destroy him. Knox picked up the locket from the table and closed it carefully and held it out to Lila. She took it without being told to put it on, clasped it around her own neck, and tucked it inside her sweatshirt. Then she looked at Knox and waited. "I'm going to bring her home," Knox said. Lila nodded once, with the gravity of someone receiving a promise they had been waiting a very long time to hear. "You're not doing this alone," Diesel said. "I know." "You don't know what you're walking into," Diesel said. "Graves has had 20 years to build. We've had 4 days." "I know," Knox said again. "Then you know this could go very bad." Knox looked at his brother, at the silver in his beard and the knee that would never be right, and the 20 years of loyalty compressed into one steady look across a kitchen table. And then he looked at Lila, and then he looked at the window, where the morning light was coming gray and cold through the pines. "It already went bad," Knox said. "A long time ago. Tonight it just got a face." He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty, and set it back down and went to the window and looked at the ridge, where the trees were black against a sky going slowly from dark gray to pale. The Softail was in the barn out back. Diesel's Road King. Cage's Sportster. Prophet's old Electra Glide, with the cracked fairing he'd been meaning to fix since summer. 4 bikes, 4 men, plus Wren, who was 5 things at once and none of them simple. 30 miles to Mercier. Somewhere between here and there, a woman was waiting in a room she hadn't chosen, in a life that had been closing around her like a fist for the better part of 2 decades. And somewhere in that compound, a man named Victor Graves was sitting in whatever room men like that sat in, and he was waiting too, and he had all the patience of someone who believed he'd already won. Knox turned away from the window. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to the specific flat dark that the people who knew him well had learned to recognize as the last stage before something irreversible. "Get me everything Wren has on the compound layout," he said. "Everything on Holloway's routines. I want to know who comes and goes and when and what they drive." He paused. "And someone call Prophet. Tell him to pack the kit. We're going to need it." He walked toward the back hall, toward the barn, toward the bikes. Behind him, the kitchen came alive with quiet, purposeful motion. The sound of men who had stopped asking whether to move and started asking how. The furnace knocked. The coffee was still hot. Through the window over the sink, the first pale light of morning was breaking cold and clean above the ridge, touching the tops of the pines, moving down through the trees in slow gray sheets. In the front room, Lila Hart sat with her knees drawn up and her hand pressed flat over the locket on her chest, and she stared at the door Knox had gone through, and she waited. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that 30 miles east, in a stone house behind an iron gate, a phone had already rung once, and the man who answered it had listened to the 2-word message from his people, and he had smiled, and he had set the phone down, and he had said to the empty room with the quiet satisfaction of a patient man whose patience had finally been rewarded, he found her. The phone call came at 4:17 in the morning. Knox was in the barn with the Softail when it happened, not working on it, not doing anything in particular, just standing beside it with his hand on the tank the way some men stood beside horses they trusted. The cold in the barn was a different quality than the cold outside. Closed in. Still. It smelled of motor oil and old straw and the particular metallic sweetness of exhaust residue soaked into wood over years. One bare bulb hung from the rafter on a cord and threw hard shadows across everything, making the bikes look larger and more serious than they already were. His phone buzzed against his thigh and he pulled it out and looked at the number. Unknown. No area code he recognized. He answered it. Silence first, not dead silence. The kind with texture, with breath on the other end, with the faint compression of someone holding a phone against their mouth and deciding how to begin. Then a woman's voice. Low and careful, and carrying something in it that sounded like the specific effort of someone who had learned to control every sound they made because sounds had consequences. "Is she safe?" Knox's hand tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" he said. It wasn't a question. Another pause. "Evelyn Hart." A breath. "Lila's mother. I know who you are. I know where she is. I need to know if she's—" The voice fractured for just a moment, one single fracture line, and then went controlled again. "Please." Knox walked out of the barn into the cold. The sky was still black, stars hard and distant, frost on the dead grass crunching under his boots. He stood in the yard and looked at the dark shape of the farmhouse and said quietly, "She's safe. She's here. She's sleeping." The sound that came through the phone then wasn't a cry. It was smaller than that and worse. A single exhaled syllable that held 2 weeks of whatever Evelyn Hart had been carrying since the day her daughter was taken from her and chained to a tree. "How are you calling me?" Knox said. "Where are you?" "I have 20 minutes, she said. "Maybe less. He lets me have a phone sometimes. It's a test. He wants to know if I'll use it wrong. I've never used it wrong before." A pause. "This is wrong." "Why now?" "Because she's been gone 4 days and Trent told Victor you found her." Her voice dropped further. Victor was pleased. That's the worst thing. When Victor is pleased, it means something terrible is already in motion. He's been in a good mood since yesterday morning, and I don't know everything it means, but I know enough. Knox walked another 10 steps into the yard and turned and looked at the ridgeline, dark against a slightly less dark sky. "Evelyn, I need you to listen to me carefully. I am coming to get you out of there. But I need information, and I need time. Can you get to a phone again?" "I don't know." "Try. 48 hours. If you can't call, find a way to signal. Anything out of the ordinary routine that someone watching the compound from outside would see." A very long silence. Long enough that he thought she'd disconnected. "You don't remember me," she said. He didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. "I didn't expect you to," she said. There was nothing accusatory in it, nothing wounded even, just the flatness of a fact absorbed long ago. "You pulled me out of a shipping container in Memphis. I was 22. I'd been in there for 3 days. You didn't ask my name. You cut the lock, and you put your jacket around me, and you said, 'There's a cab outside. Don't stop moving until you're somewhere with other people.' And then you walked back into the dark." She breathed once. "I kept walking. I didn't stop for a long time." Knox closed his eyes. "Victor had me then," she said. "He had a lot of us then. When you pulled me out, you didn't know who owned the container, but he found out who you were. Eventually." Another breath. "You were the one that got away." His words. He says it like a joke. It hasn't been a joke for a long time. The cold pressed against Knox's face and neck and hands. He stood in it and let it press and said, "Why did you stay in his reach? All these years. Why didn't you get further?" The silence this time was different, heavy with something old and layered. "I had nowhere that was far enough," she said simply. "And then I had Lila, and then I had Trent, which was its own kind of trap. And Victor's reach is longer than you think it is." A pause. "I thought about you sometimes. I thought, if I could find a way to get a message to you, but Lila finding you, that wasn't me. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. If I had known what he was planning with her," her voice went to a place that had no words in it for a moment, "I would have done something. Even if it killed me, I would have done something." Knox believed her. He wasn't sure why he was certain, but he was. "I know," he said. 20 minutes, she said. "I have to go." "The signal," he said quickly. 48 hours. Anything unusual?" "Okay." "Evelyn?" He paused. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, and the window was closing. "She's going to be all right." The line went dead. Knox stood in the yard for a while after. The frost was thickening. His breath made steady clouds that dissolved upward into the dark. He thought about a shipping container in Memphis, and a woman he'd pulled out of it, and a jacket he'd put around her shoulders, and none of the details of that night. Because there had been a lot of nights like that in those years, and they'd all compressed together into a general texture of motion and adrenaline and the particular animal satisfaction of moving someone from danger to safety. He hadn't asked names, he told himself that was professionalism. Now he thought maybe it had just been a way of not having to carry anything. He'd been carrying it for 19 years without knowing. He went inside and woke Diesel. The kitchen table became a war room by 5 in the morning. Wren had what he had, which was substantial. Photographs of the compound perimeter taken from a ridge access road the previous afternoon, a rough floor plan derived from county building permit records, and Wren's own judgment about how men like Victor Graves typically structured their spaces. A list of vehicles observed coming and going over a 72-hour surveillance window, and notes on the two-man rotation Knox's arrival window would likely encounter at the gate. Diesel had the coffee going and both hands on the table and was looking at the floor plan with the expression of a man doing tactical math. Cage leaned in the doorway with his arms crossed and his shoulder at its permanent slight angle and said nothing, which for Cage was the equivalent of several spoken concerns. Prophet sat at the far end of the table with a mug and his reading glasses and examined the photographs with the methodical patience of a man who had learned in the Marines that rushing the assessment phase was how you got people killed in the execution phase. Wren stood in the corner eating a piece of toast with no apparent emotional involvement in the proceedings, which meant he'd already done his thinking and arrived at conclusions he was waiting for the right moment to share. Knox laid out everything Evelyn had told him. He kept it factual. He kept his voice even. He did not share the part about the shipping container in Memphis, not yet, because he was still working out what that information changed about the tactical picture, and he didn't want to introduce the emotional dimension before the tactical one was stable. When he finished, Diesel looked at him for a long time. "She called you," Diesel said. "Yes." "From inside the compound?" "Yes." "And Graves lets her have a phone sometimes." "As a test." "Which she just failed." Knox nodded. Diesel sat back and rubbed the silver at his jaw. "Which means if he's monitoring the phone, and a man who's been operational for 20 years will be monitoring the phone, then he knows she called out. He knows she called you. He knows you have more information now than you had yesterday." He paused. "This changes the timeline." "I know. We can't wait 48 hours anymore, Knox." "Knox?" "I know. She might not have 48 hours. "I know," Knox said, and something in the way he said it the third time made Diesel go quiet. The room was still for a moment. Outside, wind moved against the windows, searching for the gaps in the old frames and finding several. "Okay," Diesel said, and that single word held all the recalibration a man like him was capable of, which was considerable. "Okay. So we move tonight." That was when Cage spoke. "I want to say something," Cage said from the doorway. Heads turned. Cage didn't usually lead with "I want to say something." He usually just said the thing or said nothing. "Go ahead," Diesel said. Cage unfolded his arms and pushed himself off the door frame and came into the kitchen properly, pulling out a chair and sitting down, which was significant because Cage in difficult conversations typically stayed near an exit. He put both forearms on the table and looked at Knox directly. "Tell me this is actually about getting the woman out," Cage said. "Tell me this is a rescue operation. Tell me we're not riding into a 20-year-old grudge match between you and some crime lord and using rescue as the frame because it's easier to say." The room got very quiet. Knox looked at Cage. He looked at him for a full 10 seconds without speaking, which was long enough to make Cage's jaw tighten, and then he said, "What do you think it is?" "I think you've got 19 years of something in your chest that just got a face," Cage said. "I think a woman called you this morning and told you a story that made it personal in a specific way that it wasn't personal before. And I think that changes your decision-making in ways that could get one of us killed." He paused. "Or all of us." "You're not wrong about the 19 years, Knox said. "That's not a denial." "No," Knox agreed. "It's not." He leaned forward. "Cage, there's a woman in that compound who called me tonight at risk to her own life to ask if her daughter was safe. There's a child asleep in the front room who got chained to a tree because a man decided she was a useful piece. Those things are true regardless of what's in my chest. You understand the difference?" Cage held his gaze. A long time. The kind of eye contact between men who respected each other enough to be honest with each other even when it was uncomfortable, which was not the same as the eye contact between men who agreed. "I understand the difference," Cage finally said. "I need to know you understand it." "I do. Because when it gets loud out there—" "I know who I'm writing for," Knox said quietly. Another beat. Then Cage exhaled through his nose and sat back and nodded once, slowly, and something in the room's tension released by a fraction of itself. Prophet took off his reading glasses and set them on the photograph. "We have one vehicle route to the compound that doesn't require going through Mercier. Fire Road off County 9. It's passable if we go on bikes, and it keeps us off the main approach where any of Graves County connections will be watching." "What's the terrain at the perimeter?" Diesel asked. "South fence is oldest," Wren said from the corner. "County records show the original property footprint. The additions, the guard station, the secondary structure near the back of the property, those are all newer construction and probably not on any permit record. South fence is chain link, 6 feet, no wire on top based on the photographs. East fence is newer, probably 8 feet, concertina at the top." He paused. "South fence borders an old orchard. The trees are overgrown. Cover is good." "Guards on south rotation?" Knox asked. "One in the photographs." "Could be 2 overnight. I'd plan for 2. "Can we pull the woman without going into the main house?" Prophet asked. "Depends where they're keeping her," Wren said. "If she's in the secondary structure near the back, south approach puts us closest. If she's in the main house, we have a longer exposure window." Diesel picked up one of the photographs and held it to the light. "This secondary structure size? Converted outbuilding, roughly 40 by 20 based on footprint. 1 door visible on the east face. No window visible on south or west." "Single exit," Diesel said. "That we can confirm," Wren said. "Single confirmed exit." The room sat with that. Knox said, "She told me he tested her with the phone. Let her have it. Watched whether she used it against him. She never had before." He paused. "That means she's been there long enough to be tested more than once. He's not keeping her as a temporary leverage piece. He's keeping her as a permanent one." "Against who?" Mara asked. She'd appeared in the kitchen doorway sometime in the last few minutes. Still in the scrubs she'd slept in, her hair loose, arms crossed over her chest, with the particular posture of someone who had decided they were in this meeting, whether they'd been invited or not. "Against Lila," Knox said. "Lila behaves if Evelyn is at risk. Evelyn cooperates if Lila is at risk. It's a closed system. Graves doesn't need to use violence if the threat of it is sufficient." "But Lila is gone now," Mara said. "The system broke when you pulled her off that road." "Which is why he needs a new piece," Knox said, "or why he needs to close the loop on the old one." He looked at the table, at the photographs, at the floor plan. 48 hours was always a fiction. He's already moving. Diesel put down the photograph. "Tonight," he said, not a question. "Tonight," Knox confirmed. They spent the next 8 hours in the particular disciplined busyness of men preparing for something serious. Prophet restocked and reorganized the medical kit with the efficiency of long practice, his hands moving through familiar materials with the automatic competence of someone for whom this was not an exercise. Cage went over the bikes, checking every system, his good hand doing most of the work, and his angled shoulder compensating with a stubbornness that was almost architectural. Diesel made 3 calls on a phone Knox didn't recognize, speaking in a low voice in the yard, and came back in without explaining who he'd called, and nobody asked. Wren went outside after breakfast and didn't come back until the afternoon, arriving with new information that he laid on the table without ceremony. 2 vehicles had left the compound in the last 6 hours, 1 returning with what appeared to be supplies, 1 not returning at all. "1 vehicle out and not back," Diesel said. "Routine?" "Not in the pattern I observed," Wren said. "Scouts," Knox said. "He's looking." "For what?" Cage asked. "For us," Knox said. "He knows we're somewhere. He doesn't know where. Yet." That changed the weight of the afternoon. The farmhouse had always felt like a place that existed between things. Between decisions, between movements, between the world and whatever came next. Now it felt like a place that was being found. Slowly, methodically, The way men who operated at Graves level found things, with patience and money and the specific advantage of people in positions of official authority who owed them favors. It was Lila who felt it first. She'd been quiet all day, quieter than her new norm quiet, which was itself already guarded and careful. She sat in the front room with a book Mara had found for her, one of those nature encyclopedias with photographs, and she turned the pages with the concentration of someone who is using attention to a task as a way of managing something that attention alone couldn't actually manage. Around mid-afternoon, she looked up from the book and found Knox in the kitchen doorway and said, with no preamble, "He's going to send someone." Knox came into the room and sat in the chair across from her. "What makes you say that?" "He always sends someone," she said. "When Trent did something wrong, Victor always sent someone to fix it. Trent told me once. He said Victor doesn't get angry, he just sends someone." She looked at the book without seeing it. Trent was always most scared right before someone came. Knox looked at the child for a moment. 8 years old, and she had the threat assessment vocabulary of someone twice that age and twice unfortunate. It was not an admirable thing. It was not a testament to her resilience, the way people in movies sometimes frame children's trauma as a kind of superpower. It was just damage, doing the thing damage does, which is reshape a person around itself without asking permission. "Nobody's coming here tonight," Knox said. Lila looked at him. She had the eyes of someone who needed to believe that, and also the eyes of someone who had been disappointed by that kind of statement enough times to have developed a careful relationship with it. "You'll be safe," he said. "Not because we'll stop them, because you'll be gone before they find this place." But he didn't say the second part. He said the first part and let it sit there, and he watched her decide what to do with it. She went back to the book. Knox went back to the kitchen and told Diesel they needed to move the child before dark. That conversation was short and clean, and there was no disagreement. Mara volunteered her house in Clarkson, second-floor apartment. No connection to the Brotherhood in any record or paper trail, a door with 2 deadbolts and neighbors on both sides. She would stay with Lila. She would not be alone. Prophet would put a man within sight of the building, which meant Cage, who was not riding tonight anyway because Diesel had made that call without fanfare or discussion. Cage's injured shoulder, a tactical liability he'd been told about in 2 sentences and accepted in 2 words. "I know." Cage hadn't argued. That was the thing about real men in real situations. They knew the difference between wanting to help and being able to help without making things worse. He'd taken the assignment of staying near Lila without a word of complaint and gone back to checking the bikes with the same focused energy he'd had all day, channeling the frustrated adrenaline into work. At 4 in the afternoon, Knox crouched in front of Lila and helped her into her coat, a new one, too large, bought by Mara from a thrift store 2 days ago, olive green with a broken zipper that they'd fixed with a safety pin. He zipped it to her chin and adjusted the collar, and she let him, standing very straight, watching his face. "Where am I going?" she asked. "Somewhere safer than here," he said. "Mara's place. Cage is going to be nearby." "Are you going to get her?" He held her gaze. "Yes." "Tonight?" "Yes." She studied him the way she'd studied him on the Widow Road that first night, not looking for comfort, not looking for reassurance, but doing the specific calibration of a person who had learned to read the gap between what adults said and what they actually meant. He held still under the scrutiny and didn't add anything. She reached into the collar of her sweatshirt and pulled out the locket and held it out to him. "Take it," she said. He looked at it. "Lila." "So she knows," Lila said, "when you find her. So she knows it's really you." Knox took the locket and closed it in his fist and put it in his breast pocket, directly over the place his heart was doing what hearts did. "I'll give it back," he said, "when I bring her home." Lila nodded. She put her hand flat on his chest for a moment, above the pocket, and then she turned and went to Mara, and Mara put an arm around her, and Knox stood up and watched them go. The barn smelled of winter and oil and leather. 3 bikes, Knox's Softail, Diesel's Road King, Prophet's Electroglide with the cracked fairing. 3 men checking and rechecking things that were already checked, moving through the particular choreography of preparation that had no name, but that all of them recognized from other barns, other nights, other moments before things became irreversible. They didn't talk much. That was right. That was how this kind of thing worked. You'd said all the words already, and now the words were done, and what remained was the physical reality of the task. It was Prophet who finally said it, quietly, while taping a fresh chem light to the inside of his jacket for emergency signaling. "You trust Wren's information." "Yes," Knox said. "Completely?" Knox looked up. Prophet was watching him with the calm professional eyes of a man who had made decisions about trust and risk in high-stress conditions for long enough that he asked the question not to challenge, but to ensure alignment. "I trust what he's shown me," Knox said. "I trust his methodology. I trust that he has reasons to want Graves' operation disrupted that are at least as strong as mine." He paused. "I don't know everything about Wren. I've accepted that. What I know is that in 18 months, he has not done anything that put this brotherhood at risk for his own benefit. That's my bar." Prophet considered this. Then, "Mine too." They left at 10:15. The cold was serious now. Not the playful cold of early November, but the committed cold of a season that had made up its mind. The bikes ran loud in the barn, and then they were outside and the cold air hit the engines and the sound changed, sharpened, each exhaust note clean and hard in the still air. Knox pulled out of the barn lot first, Diesel behind him, Prophet anchoring the formation, and they went down the logging road without headlights until they hit the pavement of Route 44, and then the headlights came on, and they rode. The fire road off County 9 was exactly what Prophet had promised, and worse. Overgrown, barely distinguishable from the tree line on either side, rocks half buried in frozen mud that grabbed at the front wheel if you let your attention wander. Knox rode it slow and careful, every muscle in his back and forearms working against the terrain, the Softail complaining in low tones about the abuse. Diesel behind him, Prophet behind Diesel. Nobody dropped. Nobody went down. The trees closed over them, and the moon was obscured, and they were 3 men and 3 machines moving through deep black country towards something that was going to require them to be better than the situation. They parked the bikes in the old orchard, pushed them into the trees, and covered them with the thermal blankets from the saddlebags. Then they waited, the 3 of them in the dark between apple trees gone wild and arthritic, their breath making shapes in the cold, listening to the compound 70 yards ahead. Security lights on the south fence. 2 of them, industrial flood type, mounted high and throwing hard light in overlapping cones that left a band of shadow between them. 1 guard in the light, young, overcoated, moving without purpose. Knox watched him for 8 minutes and charted the rhythm. Every 4 minutes, the guard moved from the east end of the fence to the west end and back. At the east end turn, he had his back to the south field for approximately 40 seconds. 40 seconds. Diesel's hand on Knox's shoulder. 1 squeeze, acknowledged. They went through the shadow band on the second east turn window. Diesel handled the fence, bolt cutters from his jacket, working the chain link with the practiced quiet of a man who'd done this before under worse conditions. Knox went through first, then Prophet, then Diesel came through and sealed the cut behind them with a bent wire hook that would fool a casual inspection for 30 seconds. The secondary structure was exactly where Wren said it would be. 40 by 20, dark, single door on the east face. No light from inside, no sound. The guard from the south fence was now 50 feet behind them and moving west. Knox counted the rhythm in his head and moved. The door was padlocked. Of course it was. Knox looked at the padlock and then at Prophet, and Prophet produced the tension wrench and pick from his vest pocket and crouched in front of the lock with the composure of a man picking up a newspaper from a front porch. 28 seconds. The padlock opened. Knox caught it before it could swing and make noise. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was dark, and it smelled of damp wood and cold and something else, something human. The particular smell of a person who had been confined for long enough that the space had absorbed them. His flashlight came on, beam shielded by his palm to control the throw. A room. Bare plank walls. A cot in the far corner with a gray wool blanket. A small space heater, orange light from the element. Not much warmth at this distance. A folding table with a water pitcher and a plate with something on it that had been there long enough to stop looking like food. A woman. She was sitting on the cot, upright, as though she'd heard them coming and prepared herself. Dark hair, mid-30s, thin in the way that spoke of weeks rather than appetite. She was watching the door with eyes that were doing exactly the calculation Knox would have expected. Threat assessing, rapid, practiced. The same eyes as her daughter. He moved the flashlight so it illuminated his own face rather than hers. Her breath caught. He reached into his breast pocket and held out the locket. For a moment, she didn't move. She looked at the locket and then at his face, and then at the locket again, and something happened in her expression that was too large and too private to look at directly, the way certain things in extreme moments were too large and too private to look at directly. And Knox kept his face still and held the locket and waited. She crossed the room in 4 steps and took the locket from his hand and pressed it against her chest and said, very quietly, "She's alive." "She's safe," he said. "She's with people who will protect her. We need to move now." Evelyn Hart nodded once, and she did not look back at the cot, or the heater, or the plate, or anything in the room. She moved to the door, and Knox went through first, and Prophet came last, and they were back in the dark of the compound yard with the light cones from the flood lamps making their geometry 40 yards to their left. The guard was at the west end of his circuit. They had 30 seconds. They went through the fence cut. Diesel sealed it. They moved into the orchard, and the darkness swallowed them, and they were at the bikes in 90 seconds, and Knox had his thermal blanket off the Softail and around Evelyn's shoulders before she had to ask. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes." "Behind me. Arms around my waist. Don't let go regardless of what happens." "Okay." He kicked the Softail to life, and the sound was enormous in the orchard dark, and there were exactly 2 seconds before anyone inside the compound would register it, and Knox used those 2 seconds to get moving, rolling fast through the trees, Diesel and Prophet flanking, and then they hit the fire road and the bikes opened up, and the cold hit all of them like a wall. They were 2 miles down the fire road when the lights came on behind them. Not headlights, flood lamps, the kind vehicles carried when they were looking for something in dark terrain. Sweeping, methodical, maybe a 1/4 mile back. Knox felt Evelyn's arms tighten around his waist. He opened the throttle. The fire road was still terrible, and now they were running it fast, and the front wheel was skipping over rock and frozen rut with a violence that sent shocks up through the frame and into Knox's spine and hands. But the Softail was built for terrain that punished it, and he'd rebuilt this machine with his own hands twice, and he knew every complaint it made, and he knew the difference between the complaints that meant danger and the ones that just meant discomfort. He rode the discomfort hard and kept moving. They broke onto County 9 with the lights still behind them and turned south toward the 44 junction, and Knox's phone began to vibrate in his pocket with the pattern Wren used for emergency contact. 3 short, 2 long, and Knox could not answer it because both his hands were required, and there was no stopping. But the pattern of that signal in his breast pocket against the locket, against his chest, carried its own message, which was that something had changed, and the change was serious. Diesel pulled alongside on the Road King, and his face said the same thing. He'd seen the signal pattern, too. They rode. Evelyn's face was pressed against the back of Knox's neck, her breath warm against the cold, her arms a tight circle around his chest. He could feel her heartbeat through his back, fast, steady, the heartbeat of someone who was terrified and running and holding on with everything they had and not letting go. The 44 junction was a mile ahead. After that, another 12 miles to the edge of Clarkson, and then left toward the hills and the farm. But the lights were still behind them, and they weren't gaining. These bikes on this road in the hands of men who knew them could outrun whatever vehicle was behind them on the rough terrain, but they weren't dropping back either. Graves people knew the county roads. They had radios. They had people. Knox's phone went to 4 short pulses this time. Wren's second code. He'd never used the second code before. Neither of them had needed it. It meant abort primary route. Knox processed this in the approximately 1 second he had available and made the decision before he'd finished processing it, which was the only way to make decisions when everything was moving fast and the consequences of being wrong were immediate and irreversible. He cut left off County 9 at the Farrow Creek turnoff instead of continuing to the 44 junction. Diesel saw it and followed without a signal needed. Prophet, behind Diesel. The Farrow Creek road was narrower and darker, and the flood lamps behind them lost them for a moment in the curve, and Knox used that moment to breathe and think. Wren's abort signal meant the primary route was compromised. Means someone was ahead of them on the 44. Means Graves had already called his people in the county and they'd laid something across the primary exit while the compound security pushed them from behind. They'd been ready. Graves had been ready. Of course he'd been ready. A man who'd been patient for 19 years did not stop being patient on the night that mattered. He'd let them come in. He'd let them take her. He'd let them start moving. And now he was closing the shape of the thing around them at a distance and a timing of his own choosing. Knox thought, he wanted her out. He wanted her mobile. He wanted her where I had to keep moving fast and couldn't consolidate. He thought, this isn't about stopping us. He thought, this is about making sure I'm somewhere specific at a specific time. He thought, he's been moving pieces for 19 years and every piece is still where he put it, and I just picked up the last one. Behind him, Evelyn said something that the wind tore apart before it could reach him. He couldn't hear it. He could feel her arms around his chest and her heartbeat and the warmth of her against his back and the weight of the locket in his pocket and the cold road ahead and the light still somewhere behind them in the dark. He rode. But somewhere in the part of his mind that never stopped doing tactical math, a number was resolving, not a distance, not a speed, a count. He had 3 men, including himself, 3 bikes, 1 civilian, 12 miles of compromised road between him and any version of safety he could currently picture, and a man who had been building toward this moment since a night in Memphis when Knox had cut a padlock and changed the shape of someone's life without knowing it and walked back into the dark. The lights were still behind them. And somewhere ahead, on a road Knox hadn't chosen yet, something else was waiting. The thing that had been patient for 19 years was done waiting. The Faro Creek Road ran out in exactly 3 miles. Knox knew this. He'd known it when he turned onto it, had filed the knowledge away in the back of his mind the way you filed information you hoped you wouldn't need and knew you would. The road terminated at an old grain cooperative that had been shuttered for a decade, a cluster of corrugated metal buildings and 1 concrete loading dock sitting in a gravel lot behind a chain-link fence that had never been serious hardware. Beyond the cooperative, another half-mile of track through heavy timber before the land dropped off at the creek itself, which at November levels was crossable on foot, but not on 3 loaded motorcycles. 3 miles, then a dead end, then water. He ran the math in the time it took to cover the first mile, and the math was bad. The flood lamps behind them had been keeping pace, not gaining, not dropping back, just maintaining the distance with the patience of vehicles that knew exactly where this road ended. Knox's mirror showed the light diffuse through his own exhaust into a pale smear, constant and relentless. Diesel was tight on his left. Prophet was off his right rear, the Electroglide's headlight a fixed star in the dark. Evelyn's arms were still locked around Knox's chest, with a grip that had not loosened since the compound, and her face was still pressed against the back of his neck, and he could feel every breath she took, quick and shallow and controlled. She wasn't panicking. That registered. She was frightened. He could feel that too, in the tension of her arms and the way her whole body was compressed against his back. But she was not coming apart, and she was not asking questions, and she was not doing any of the things that made the already difficult more difficult. Whatever she'd survived in the last several years had stripped away the luxury of visible panic. He filed that under things he'd think about later. His phone went to 5 pulses. Wren's 3rd code. He'd never used the 3rd code. Knox had never used it either. They'd established it 18 months ago as a contingency designation for the situation that was too bad to describe in the first 2 codes and too specific to leave unaddressed. The code meant, they know where you're going. Knox cut the throttle on the softail, and the engine dropped from a sustained roar to a heavy idle, and then he stopped entirely, gravel crunching under his boots as he put his feet down. Diesel pulled alongside. Prophet came in close on the other side. "Faro dead ends," Diesel said. Not explaining, just confirming they were thinking the same thing. "3rd code," Knox said. Diesel's face in the darkness. "They're ahead of us too." "Has to be." A pause. Both of them listening. Behind them, the flood lamps had stopped moving. They could see the stationary glow beyond the last bend, maybe a 1/4 mile back. Waiting. They were being parked. "The cooperative," Prophet said. "We get inside, off the road. Think." It wasn't a good option. It was the only option. So Knox kicked the Softail back into motion, and they covered the last 2 miles and came through the cooperative's fence. The chain link had been down in one corner for years, folded back by weather or vandals or time, and pulled the bikes into the largest of the corrugated metal buildings, the old grain storage unit, and killed the engines. The silence was enormous. Corrugated walls and a concrete floor, and the smell of old grain dust and rust, and the cold that had been sealed inside the building long enough to become its own weather. 2 thin strips of moonlight came through the gaps where the roof panels had warped away from each other. Everything else was dark. Knox helped Evelyn off the bike. She stood on her own immediately, which was the correct instinct, and he could see her in the thin moonlight doing the same assessment he was doing, cataloging exits, calculating sight lines, establishing position. She looked at him once. He nodded. She nodded back. "There's a rear access on the north face," Wren's voice said. Everyone in the building went still. Knox turned slowly. Wren was standing near the back wall of the building, 30 feet from where they'd parked the bikes, in the deeper dark where the moonlight didn't reach. He was holding a phone with the screen dimmed to almost nothing. His coffee was gone. Both hands were visible. "How long have you been here?" Diesel said. His voice was completely flat, which was the most dangerous version of Diesel's voice. "Long enough," Wren said. "I came ahead when I saw the pattern on the county feed. There are 2 vehicles at the Faro 9 junction behind you. There are 2 more on the 44 approach, and there is one at the Mercier County line on the alternate south route." He paused. "He's got 6 coverage points. He's not trying to stop you. He's trying to concentrate you." "Into what?" Prophet said. "Into somewhere specific." Wren moved closer, into the edge of the moonlight. His face was doing something Knox had not seen it do before in 18 months. It was doing something careful and reluctant and braced. "Knox, I need to tell you something." Knox looked at him. "I need you to hear it completely before you respond to it," Wren said. The building was very still. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees and the creek, something moved and was silent again. Animal or wind or neither. "Say it," Knox said. Wren looked at the floor for one moment, then back up. "Victor Graves is not planning to intercept you tonight. He doesn't need to intercept you. He has everything he needs to end this without a confrontation on a back road." He paused. "What he's planning to do is let you get somewhere you feel safe, and then he's going to use what he has to take it all apart from the inside." "What does he have?" Knox said. Wren's jaw moved. A small preparation. "He has Trent Holloway, and he has what Trent gave him." He looked at Knox steadily. "Trent Holloway has been cooperating with a federal task force for 14 months. There is a RICO case being built against Graves' operation. Trent is the inside witness." He stopped. "But Trent has been playing both sides. He's been feeding information to the task force and simultaneously feeding the task force's information back to Graves. The federal agents running the case, 3 of them, are now names on a list that Graves has had for 11 months. Knox heard this. He stood with it for a moment. "That's not about me," Knox said carefully. "No," Wren agreed. "This part is." He exhaled once. "One of those federal agents, the case supervisor. Her name is Dana Reyes. She's been running the task force out of a field office in Nashville." He paused. "She's also the woman who recruited me to get close to the Black Horizon Brotherhood 18 months ago." The building became a different kind of still. Knox felt the words land. He felt them land the way a blow to the sternum landed, not with immediate pain, but with the sudden impossible absence of air, the body's blank refusal to process what just happened. He looked at Wren. Wren looked back at him and didn't look away and didn't say anything else, and Knox understood that the not looking away was intentional. Was Wren giving him the full straight version rather than packaging it in anything softer? Because softening it would have been an additional insult. "You're federal," Knox said. "I was," Wren said. "Contracted. Not badge carrying. The distinction matters legally and does not matter to you right now. I understand that." Behind Knox, Diesel had moved. He'd moved the way big men moved when something very serious had just restructured the room. Not toward Wren, not aggressively, but to a position that was both lateral and readied, his full attention locked, and the rest of him very quiet. Prophet hadn't moved at all. He was watching Wren with the expression of a man doing rapid and radical recalculation. Evelyn had stepped back 2 steps along the wall. Her eyes were going between Wren and Knox. 18 months, Knox said. Yes. Everything you brought, every piece of information, the compound layout, the guard rotation, the vehicle pattern. Real, Wren said immediately. All of it. The infiltration tonight worked because the information was accurate. I did not put any of you in danger with false intelligence. That's not the question, Knox said. I know. The question is what you were building while you were here. Wren's jaw tightened. A case. Against Graves. Graves has been operational for 20 years because he has protection at levels that make local or state prosecution impossible. The federal case is the only path that actually puts him down permanently. He paused. I came in to establish the Brotherhood's position relative to Graves, to confirm you weren't operationally connected to him, to document the protection work the Brotherhood does and distinguish it clearly from organized criminal activity. A breath. Which I did. The Brotherhood is clean in the federal file. Completely. That was also real. You built a file on us, Diesel said. His voice was still flat. Without asking. Yes. You sat at our table, you slept under our roof, you rode with us. Yes. And you were writing it down. The pause before Wren answered was exactly 1 second long. Yes. Diesel looked at Knox. Knox looked at the concrete floor. He was breathing steadily through his nose, in, out, the deliberate rhythm of a man keeping something contained that wanted very badly to not be contained. His hands were at his sides. He was aware of them. He was counting the specific weight of the betrayal and simultaneously running the tactical implications, and the 2 processes were running in parallel, and neither one was finished, and neither one could wait for the other. Why are you telling me this now? Knox said, not looking up yet. Because the federal case collapsed 3 days ago, Wren said. Trent's double dealing was exposed by Graves' people inside the task force. 2 of the 3 federal agents on the case are now missing. The third, Dana Reyes, went dark 48 hours ago. I cannot reach her. I don't know if she's alive. He paused. The case is gone. The protection it provided, to me, to you, to Evelyn, to anyone connected to this situation, is gone. And Graves now has no reason to be careful. Knox looked up. He's not concentrating us for an arrest, Knox said. No, Wren said. He's concentrating us because he's done waiting. Yes. And you knew the case was collapsing when you helped us plan the extraction tonight. This was the hardest moment. This was the moment Wren's face did the thing it had been braced for since Knox turned and saw him standing in the dark. I thought we'd be clear before he moved. I miscalculated the timing. He stopped. I am sorry. That is insufficient, and I know it, and I'm telling you anyway. The building held the silence for a long and specific time. Knox had known men in combat who'd made the call to withhold information under time pressure because they believed the mission would succeed before the withheld information became relevant. He'd seen it go right twice and wrong 4 times. He understood the psychology. He understood the calculation. He did not, in this moment, particularly care about either. What he cared about was the picture that was assembling itself from all the pieces now that the last piece had been added. Graves had known about Wren. Of course he had. A man with people inside a federal task force would have known about any contracted asset working the Brotherhood angle. He'd known Wren was here and he'd let it continue because it suited him. Because Wren, embedded in the Brotherhood, was a kind of surveillance. Because 18 months of Wren at this table had given Graves 18 months of real-time intelligence on the only group of men who might have eventually come at him with the specific combination of capability and motivation to do real damage. Knox had thought he was moving on Graves tonight. He'd thought he was the one making the play. He'd been the piece being moved. From the beginning, from the Widow Road, from the first bar of signal on the phone, from the photograph in the Locket, the phone call in the yard, the abort code on the fire road. All of it shaped by Graves' patient hands over 19 years, brought to this night, brought to this building, brought to this dead end on a road with water at one end and vehicles at the other, and one man inside who had been watching and writing for 18 months. Knox picked up an empty wooden pallet from the floor and threw it against the wall. The sound it made was tremendous in the metal building. A concussive crack, and then the rattle of boards, and then silence. Evelyn didn't flinch. Diesel didn't move. Prophet looked at the wall and then back at Knox. Wren stood where he was and let it happen. Knox stood with his hands at his sides and his chest working and the echo dying in the corrugated walls around them. Then he said very quietly, "Can you reach anyone? Any functional federal contact? Anyone who still has the authority to move on Graves tonight?" Wren said, "I've been trying since the case collapsed." "That's not an answer." "No," Wren said, "I cannot reach anyone. The network is burned. The pipeline is gone." "Then you have nothing," Knox said. "I have the intelligence I built over 18 months, Wren said. "I have the compound layout, the personnel structure, the operational map of Graves' entire county network. I have documentation of every corrupt official on his payroll and every transaction I could document. It's all in a secure archive that I can transmit to 3 independent journalists and 2 federal oversight bodies the moment I have a signal window." He paused. "It won't stop tonight, but it will end him. Eventually." "Eventually," Diesel said. The word was very dry. "I know what it sounds like," Wren said. "It sounds like eventually doesn't help us right now," Diesel said. Outside, something changed. The sound changed. The absence of sound changed. The specific quality of the quiet around the building shifting from the quiet of a vacant rural night to the quiet of something approaching from multiple directions and doing it carefully. Knox registered it before he could name it, the hair on his forearms rising under his jacket, some animal part of his brain that had been kept alive through 2 combat tours firing its oldest and most reliable alarm. He held up one hand. Everyone went still. There. The faint crunch of gravel, once, twice, not from the direction they'd come in, from the north face of the building, where Wren had mentioned the rear access, and simultaneously, fainter, from the east, the tree-lined side of the cooperative lot. They'd been patient. They'd waited until the conversation was done, because Graves people were professional enough to know that men talking in a building were not men watching the perimeter, and because there was no urgency in moving immediately when you had the exits covered and the men inside had nowhere to go. Knox made 3 fast hand signals. No words. They didn't need words. Diesel moved toward the bikes. Prophet pulled the kit from his saddlebag and tucked it under his jacket. Evelyn pressed flat against the wall to Knox's left without being told to, choosing the position instinctively, staying in the building's shadow rather than the moonlight strips. Good. She understood movement and darkness. That was going to matter. Knox looked at Wren. Wren looked back at him. "North access," Knox said quietly. "You said north access." "Yes." "How many entry points on this building?" 3 confirmed. Main east face, north access panel, and a deteriorated section of the south wall near the back corner. The panel there is loose. It'll move from the outside. Knox processed the building's geometry. 3 access points, 3 coverage positions outside, but the vehicles at the Faro Junction were still behind them, which meant the people who'd moved in close were the advanced element, light and quiet, not the vehicles. 6 coverage points total on the road network meant most of those were anchoring the exits, not closing in personally. How many actually here, right now, in the cooperative lot? He could hear 2 position signatures, possibly 3, not overwhelming numbers, but professional ones. "The north panel," Knox said. "Does it open out or in?" "Out," Wren said. "Old construction. Outswing." "Does the orchard side of the property line give any approach toward the creek bank from the north?" Wren thought for exactly the right amount of time, the amount that said he was genuinely checking his mental map rather than filling space. "Yes. If you stay along the fence line from the north panel, there's a drop into the creek drainage channel about 150 yards east. The channel runs southeast, away from the coverage points." "On foot?" "On foot." Knox looked at the bikes. Diesel read it, and his jaw tightened. "Knox." "They're already watching the road," Knox said. The bikes put us back on roads where they have coverage. On foot through the drainage channel, we're off every road in their network. It's November, Prophet said. Creek channel. Cold mud. Evelyn isn't... I'm fine, Evelyn said. Quietly, but with an absolute finish to it. The tone of someone who had learned to say exactly that and make it stay said. Prophet looked at her. He didn't argue. The bikes, Diesel said again. His voice was lower now. Knox met his eyes. Leave them. The word landed between them like something physical and permanent. These machines, not just transportation, not just equipment, but the accumulated miles and labor of years, the specific texture of who they were and how they moved through the world. Knox's Softail that he'd rebuilt twice. Diesel's Road King with the dent on the tank from a rain-slick highway outside Nashville that he'd never had fixed because he'd decided to keep the reminder. Prophet's Electra Glide with the cracked fairing he'd been meaning to fix since summer. Leave them. Diesel held Knox's gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he said, Lead. They went through the north access panel in single file, Knox first, then Evelyn, then Prophet, then Diesel, then Wren last, closing the panel as carefully as its loose hinges allowed. The gravel of the cooperative lot was white in the moonlight, and they moved along the shadow of the building's north face without crossing into the light, and Knox counted their footsteps against the ambient sound and heard nothing from the east side yet, which meant the east position had not moved yet, which gave them some margin. The fence line was exactly where Wren said it was. They moved along it fast and low, the dead orchard grass breaking under their boots, each step a controlled landing to minimize sound. And the cold was the full-body committed kind that got into the gaps between clothing and skin and made the smaller muscles in your hands start to protest. Knox ignored it. Everyone ignored it. That was the training and also the specific adrenaline chemistry of people who knew that warmth was a problem for later. The drainage channel appeared as a sudden drop in the ground, 3 feet of eroded bank, and Knox went over it first and landed in mud that swallowed his boots to mid-calf and held. He turned and put his hands up, and Evelyn came over the bank, and he caught her and set her down, and she pulled her feet out of the mud with 2 sucking sounds and moved without complaint. Prophet came over, then Diesel, who landed hard and came up with his jaw set against the knee that would never be right. Then Wren. They moved southeast in the channel. The water was 6 inches deep in the center and ice-edged at the margins, and the mud was the specific mud of a Tennessee Creek drainage in November, which meant it had opinions about footwear and expressed them constantly. The sound of their movement in the channel was unavoidable. Water, mud, the soft percussion of bodies pushing through cold, resisting terrain. But the channel walls were 4 feet high on either side, and the sound stayed inside them rather than traveling out across the flat cooperative lot behind. 200 yards. 300. Knox was counting in his head, maintaining orientation by the position of the moon and the slope of the channel, keeping them southeast, keeping them moving. Behind them, far behind now, back at the building, a sound. A door or a panel moved with less care than they'd used. Then a voice. Not loud, professional voice control, but a voice which meant the east position had entered the building and found it empty and was now communicating this to someone else. Knox put his hand up once. Everyone stopped, listening. A second voice. Answering. Still distant. Still inside the building's acoustic envelope. Not in the channel yet. He lowered his hand. They kept moving. The channel turned south and then southwest, and then the walls dropped from 4 feet to 18 inches as the terrain flattened and Knox knew they were reaching the lower drainage area and the cover was going to thin out. He stopped them at the last section of deep channel and crouched and looked over the bank. A field. Old pasture, fallow, the dead grass knee-high. No floodlights, no visible vehicles. The tree line of a hardwood stand about 400 yards to the southwest. And beyond it, if he was orienting correctly, the township road that connected to the far southern edge of County 9, well beyond any of the coverage points Wren had identified. He looked at Wren. Wren looked at the terrain and nodded once. That tree line, Knox said. They went over the bank and into the field, moving fast now, the dead grass pushing against their legs, the ground below it uneven with old furrow lines, everyone's breath making quick white shapes in the cold air. 400 yards. Knox was aware of every variable: Diesel's knee, Evelyn's condition, the time since the voices in the building, the fact that professional people with radios and a network of covered roads were now aware that their targets had gone on foot and were probably already triangulating a reacquisition corridor. Halfway across the field, Evelyn went down. Not a stumble. A full fall, her right foot catching in a buried furrow, her body going forward and sideways at once. Knox was turning before she hit the ground. Some peripheral awareness he couldn't name registering the change in her movement pattern a fraction of a second before the fall. And he caught part of her weight as she went down, but not all of it, and she hit the frozen ground with her left shoulder, and a sound she tried to suppress, and didn't entirely. He had her up in 2 seconds. She was already pushing back to standing. "Keep going," she said, breathless. "Your shoulder." "Keep going," she said again, and the finish on it was the same absolute quality as before, and Knox kept going, his hand on her arm, and they reached the tree line and went into the dark between the hardwoods and stopped. Everyone breathing hard. Diesel with one hand on his knee, not nursing it, just resting the weight of his palm against the point of chronic complaint. Prophet already had his hands on Evelyn's shoulder, probing with quick clinical fingers. She winced once and held still. "Separated or bruised," Prophet said quietly. "I can't tell which without more light. It needs to be immobilized." He pulled the sleeve from his own jacket, cut it at the seam with the knife from his belt, the small folding one he kept for medical work, and fashioned a sling with 2 minutes of practiced assembly, and helped Evelyn into it, and she accepted it without argument, and the shoulder was immobilized, and that was the best available. Knox looked at Wren. They were standing 3 feet apart in the dark of the hardwood stand, the field behind them empty and pale under the moon. The township rode a dim line through the trees ahead. Somewhere to the north, in the cooperative lot, professional people were conducting a methodical search pattern and putting new positions on a radio net. "Tell me everything you haven't told me," Knox said. Wren's breath made a cloud. He looked at the field, then at Knox. "Graves has a man inside the county sheriff's department who has been tracking the Brotherhood's safe house location for 3 months, Wren said. "I don't know if he's confirmed the farm yet. I think he has." He paused. "Lila and Mara and Cage are—" "I know," Knox said. He pulled out his phone. One bar, the same one bar that had started all of this on the Widow Road, that bar that now felt like a joke told over 19 years by a man who had a very particular sense of humor. He called Cage. It rang twice. Cage answered on the 3rd ring, and the sound of his voice, steady, alert, already awake, which meant he'd been awake, sent a specific quality of relief through Knox's chest that he registered and put aside. "We need to move," Knox said. "Right now. Get Lila and Mara in the truck. The back roads, not the main. You know the route I mean." "Yeah," Cage said. "How long to be rolling?" 4 minutes? "Make it 3. Copy." A pause. "You all good?" Knox looked at the field, at the tree line, at the people around him, Diesel and his knee and his silver-streaked jaw and his absolute steadiness, Prophet, and the sling he'd cut from his own sleeve. Evelyn standing straight with her arm in that sling and her dark eyes doing the same assessment they'd been doing since he walked into that room. Wren, who was a thing Knox did not yet have a complete word for, standing in the dark with his secrets and his archive and his insufficient apologies. "Getting there," Knox said. He ended the call. Diesel said, "The farm is compromised." "Probably," Knox said, "which means we have no base." "No. No bikes, no base. 1 civilian with a separated shoulder, 3 men, and—" Diesel looked at Wren. "And him," Knox said. He looked at Wren. "Your archive, the 18 months of documentation." "Secure," Wren said. 3 separate servers. I can transmit with any signal window." "That's the only move that ends this permanently," Knox said. "You know that." "Yes." "Then we need a signal window, and we need to be somewhere Graves can't close before the transmission completes." He thought about the county network, the coverage points, the professional patience of the people in the cooperative lot. He thought about Graves in his stone house behind the iron gate, phone in hand, pieces on a board that he'd been arranging for 19 years. satisfied and patient, and already seen the end of this. He thought about Lila's hand on his chest above the locket, the weight of it, the specific and unbearable trust in that gesture. He thought about a shipping container in Memphis and a woman he hadn't asked the name of, and 19 years of a road that had been leading here without his knowledge. Something in Knox settled. Not calm. It wasn't calm. It was the thing that comes after the last option disappears, and what remains is clarity, the specific cold lucidity of a man who has stopped choosing between good and bad options because those are gone, and what's left is simply what must be done. There's a broadcast tower on Dutton Ridge, Knox said. County Emergency Communications Relay. Hardwired signal amplification. If we get to the tower, the transmission window is unlimited. He looked at Wren. That enough for your archive? More than enough, Wren said. Dutton Ridge, Diesel said. That's 16 miles from here. On foot, with no bikes, one hurt civilian, and Graves County network between us and it. He said this not as an objection, but as a complete accounting of facts, which was Diesel's way. Yes, Knox said. Diesel looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the moon, briefly, with an expression that contained whatever a man contained when he looked at the last clear thing in a dark sky. Okay, Diesel said. They moved into the trees. Behind them, across the pale field, a light swept the far edge of the pasture. Slow and methodical. Looking. Knox did not look back. He was 16 miles from the only move left that mattered, in the dark, on foot, with a man he didn't fully trust, and a woman who had survived everything this county had thrown at her, and two brothers who had said, okay, when okay was the hardest word in the language, and somewhere in a truck on a back road, a child was being moved again through the cold, carrying no locket now, nothing but faith in a man who'd cut a chain on a frozen road and made a promise. Knox walked. The hardwood stand closed around them, and the moonlight thinned, and the cold pressed in, and somewhere behind the ridgeline to the east, so distant it might have been weather, the first sound reached them that was not wind and not footsteps and not breathing. It was an engine, multiple engines, not motorcycles, coming from the north. And Knox realized, with the particular clarity of a man whose last option had just been given a deadline, that Graves wasn't done moving pieces. Neither was Knox. The engines were getting louder. Knox counted them by sound. 2 vehicles, heavy, moving fast on the township road to their north, which meant someone had pulled the coverage from a road exit and redirected toward their position. That was a decision that required information, which meant they'd been spotted crossing the field, or the county network had triangulated the foot pattern, or someone with a radio and a map had done the math on where 3 men and a woman moving southeast on foot would logically shelter. Didn't matter which. The result was the same. Move, Knox said. They moved through the hardwood stand at a pace that was no longer cautious. Branches at face height, root lines grabbing at boots, the frozen ground uneven and punishing. Diesel was limping. Not badly, not yet, but the knee was registering every impact, and Knox could hear it in the rhythm of his footfalls, the slight hesitation at each landing. Prophet had his hand on Evelyn's good arm, not guiding her but staying in contact, a professional's way of tracking without patronizing. Wren moved through the trees with a particular economy that Knox clocked and filed. The man moved like someone who had done this specific thing before, and not in training scenarios. The township road came visible through the tree line as headlights, moving, slowing. They stopped. The vehicles, 2 black SUVs, the kind with no plates or plates that wouldn't match anything real, pulled into the field access gate 60 yards north and stopped. Doors opened. Men got out. Knox counted 4. Dark clothing. Moving with the spread and cover pattern of people who knew what they were doing. 4 men, professional, between them and Dutton Ridge. Knox looked at Diesel. Diesel looked at the 4 men, then at Knox. There was a long, wordless exchange that covered every relevant fact and concluded in under 2 seconds. Wren, Knox said quietly, can you transmit from here? Any signal? Wren checked his phone. No, too much terrain interference. I need elevation. Then we go through them. He didn't wait for discussion. He came out of the tree line, moving fast and low across the 30 yards of open ground between the trees and the field access, closing the distance before the nearest of Graves' men had completed his first coverage sweep, and he hit the man at a full-run shoulder tackle that took them both into the frozen ground with a force that drove the air from both of them simultaneously. Knox had the better of it because he'd been ready for it. He came up from the ground and the man didn't, and Knox turned to find the second figure already moving toward him, and he took the first blow. A right cross to the jaw that tasted like iron and sparked white at the edge of his vision, and used the momentum of it to get inside and brought his elbow up hard under the man's chin with everything he had. The man went down. Behind him, Diesel had engaged the third. Diesel at full commitment was not an experience most men walked away from without a specific and lasting memory of it. 230 pounds, moving with a purpose that superseded pain, the bad knee simply not consulted on the matter. The third man swung once and missed, and Diesel closed the gap, and it was over in the time it took Knox to blink the white sparks from his vision. The fourth man had Prophet. He'd gotten behind Prophet and had an arm across his throat and the other hand pulling something from his jacket that was going to change the situation permanently if it cleared the holster, and Evelyn Hart came in from the man's left side with a rock she'd picked up somewhere in the tree line and hit him across the back of the skull with both hands and enough committed force that the rock broke. The man dropped. Prophet caught his breath in 3 quick gasps and looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the man on the ground and then at the rock in her hand and set it down and said nothing. "Okay," Prophet said. That was all. Knox's jaw was swelling already. He could feel it, the specific heat and pressure of a bruise building. He worked his jaw once, testing the joint, and it moved correctly, and he moved on. "Keys," Diesel said. He was already crouching over the nearest SUV driver, going through pockets. He came up with a key fob. He held it up. Knox looked at the vehicles, then at Wren. "Dutton Ridge," Knox said. "How far by road from here?" 7 miles, Wren said, "but the road goes through Graves County coverage." "In his own vehicles," Knox said. Wren processed this, the specific kind of pause that preceded a decision about acceptable risk. "It might hold long enough." "Long enough is all we need." They took the closer SUV. Knox drove because it was not a conversation. Diesel took the passenger seat with the window down and his forearm on the door, watching the road ahead with the flat attention of a man cataloging threats. Prophet and Evelyn in the back. Wren beside them with his phone out, watching the signal bars. Knox drove fast and kept the headlights on because dark vehicles running without lights drew more attention than vehicles running normally, and everything about this needed to look routine for as long as routine was available. 3 miles. The road climbed into the ridge country, the pine stands thickening on both sides, the temperature dropping another degree for every 100 feet of elevation. Wren said, "Signal." Knox said, "Start it." "I need 4 minutes of clean signal to complete the transmission." "You'll have it." They came around a long curve at the 4-mile mark and the road was blocked. Not vehicles this time. One vehicle. A county sheriff's cruiser sitting sideways across both lanes with its light bar running, red and blue painting the pine trees in rhythmic color. One man standing in front of it, uniform, hand raised. Knox didn't brake. He hit the shoulder at 60, the SUV's right tires leaving the pavement and churning through the gravel and frozen grass with a violence that threw everyone against their seatbelts, and he went around the cruiser's front end with 6 inches of clearance and was back on the pavement and accelerating before the deputy had processed what had happened. In the mirror, the cruiser's door opened. Then a radio call Knox could hear the crackle of without the words. 3 miles, Diesel said. 2 minutes, Knox said. The road steepened. The SUV's engine worked up through the gears, headlights sweeping the dark wall of pine on either side. Knox's hands were tight on the wheel, and his jaw was fire, and he could taste blood from where the first blow had split the inside of his cheek, a thin copper edge to every breath. Wren said, "Transmission is running." "How long?" 3 minutes 40 seconds. "We'll be at the ridge in 2. The signal needs to hold from the tower. We need to be at the tower." Knox looked at the road. The road looked back. Straight, steep, empty. They made the ridge access in 90 seconds, and Knox brought the SUV hard into the gravel lot at the base of the communications tower, and they were out of the vehicle before it fully stopped, Knox's boots hitting gravel at a run, and the tower was there. A 120-foot lattice structure rising into the cold black sky, the red aircraft warning light at its apex blinking its slow, patient pattern. Wren was already at the base with his phone in both hands. 2 bars. 3. The tower's signal amplification doing exactly what Knox had counted on it doing. "Transmitting," Wren said. "How long?" 1 minute 50? From the road below the ridge, headlights appeared. Multiple sets. Moving fast. Diesel saw them the same moment Knox did. He positioned himself beside the SUV, between the vehicle and the road, between the road and the tower, between whatever was coming and the thing that needed to finish. Prophet moved to Diesel's flank. Evelyn moved too. Prophet put his hand out to stop her, and she looked at his hand and then at him, and he looked at her and lowered it. The first vehicle came into the gravel lot fast and hard, its headlights sweeping across all of them, and the door opened before it had fully stopped, and the man who stepped out was not one of Graves' security professionals. He was Victor Graves. Knox had built a picture of Victor Graves from fragments over 4 days, from Wren's descriptions, from Lila's sparse and precise child observations, from Evelyn's phone call in the dark yard. The picture he'd built was of someone large and abstract, a man-shaped accumulation of 19 years of patience and damage. The actual man was 60, medium height, silver-haired, trim, wearing a dark jacket over a collared shirt, the jacket too light for November at elevation, as though he'd left in a hurry and hadn't bothered with the cold. His face was unremarkable. That was the thing Knox noticed first, the complete ordinariness of it. The face of a man you'd pass in a hardware store and forget in 3 minutes. He had 2 men with him. They stayed at the vehicle. Graves walked toward Knox and stopped 8 feet away. He looked at Knox the way a man looked at something he'd been waiting a long time to look at. Not angry, not triumphant. Something more settled than either. The satisfaction of a completed thing. "You came all this way," Graves said. His voice was conversational. "I wasn't sure you'd make it to the ridge." 1 minute, Wren said from the tower base. Graves didn't look at Wren. He kept his eyes on Knox. "That won't matter," he said. "The oversight contacts that archive is going to. 2 of them are mine. Have been for years. Your friend has been building a case inside a structure I already owned." Knox held his gaze. "You're here," Knox said. "Why are you here yourself?" Graves tilted his head slightly. "Because I wanted to see your face," he said simply. 19 years is a long time to wait for a face. 40 seconds, Wren said. His voice was completely flat. "Wren," Graves said, still looking at Knox, "you can stop." Wren did not stop. Graves finally looked at him. Something shifted in his expression. The first crack in the settled satisfaction, thin as a fault line but present. "I said stop." 30 seconds, Wren said. Graves raised his hand and one of the 2 men at the vehicle moved forward and Knox moved at the same moment, stepping hard into Graves' space, close enough that the man had to look up to maintain eye contact, close enough that the 2 of them were breathing the same cold air. "Look at me," Knox said. Graves looked at him. "You put a child on a chain," Knox said. His voice was very quiet. 8 years old, barefoot, in November. You put a child on a chain to get my attention." He let that sit in the space between them for exactly 1 second. "And you got it." Graves' jaw tightened. "Transmission complete," Wren said. The words hit the cold air and hung there, and Victor Graves heard them, and the fault line in his expression opened into something wider. Not fear, not yet, but the specific look of a man watching the shape of something he'd built for 19 years change into a shape he hadn't planned. His hand dropped. Behind Knox, engines crested the ridge road. Not SUVs, motorcycles. 3 of them, headlights sweeping the gravel lot, the sound Knox knew better than his own heartbeat. He turned and the headlights hit him, and behind them, pulling in hard and fast and dropping kickstands on gravel, were Cage and 2 bikes Knox recognized from the Brotherhood's extended network, men who had answered a call in the time it had taken Knox to drive 7 miles. Cage was off his bike before it stopped rocking. He was across the lot in 5 strides. He looked at Knox and the swelling jaw and the blood and said one word, "Lila's safe." Knox exhaled. He turned back to Victor Graves. Graves was looking at the motorcycles, at the men getting off them, at Diesel and Prophet standing at the SUV, at Evelyn, who had moved from Prophet's side to stand in the headlight beam where she was fully visible, her arm in its makeshift sling, her face completely composed, looking at Graves with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in this position and intended to stay in it. Graves looked at all of it. At 19 years assembled against him on a cold ridge in November, with the transmission already gone and the pieces no longer where he'd put them. He looked at Knox, and Knox looked back at him and said, very quietly, the way you said things that didn't need volume because they were already true. "It's done." Graves said nothing. His hands were at his sides. His jacket was too light for the cold. The red light at the top of the tower blinked once, twice. Its slow and patient rhythm unchanged. Somewhere below the ridge, sirens. Not county. Federal. The specific two-tone of federal emergency vehicles that Knox had heard enough times in enough situations to know the difference. Wren's archive had gone somewhere functional after all. 3 servers, 2 journalists, 2 oversight bodies. Somewhere in that network, someone had been waiting for exactly this transmission and had moved the moment it arrived. Victor Graves heard the sirens. Knox watched his face. And for the first time in 19 years of patience, the man who had put a child on a chain to settle an old account stood in the cold on a ridge in Tennessee and had nothing left to move. And Knox Ryder stood in the cold and watched the patience go out of Victor Graves the way a fire went out when the last fuel was gone, not dramatically, not with sound, but simply with a cessation, a reduction to something smaller and colder than what had been there before. Graves didn't run. Knox had half expected him to, in those final seconds before the federal vehicles came up the ridge road, and had been prepared for it. But the man stood where he was, both hands at his sides, and watched the headlights come, and the thing on his face was not defeat exactly, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had spent 19 years being certain of the ending and had arrived at a different one and was still processing the distance between those two things. The federal vehicles were 3 SUVs, not county, with men in tactical vests who moved with the specific economy of people executing a prepared operation rather than responding to a surprise. They spread across the gravel lot with practiced geometry. One of them spoke to Wren briefly, and Wren answered briefly and showed something on his phone, and the man nodded and moved away. 2 of them took Victor Graves. He went without resistance. That was the thing Knox watched, the absence of resistance. Not compliance, not cooperation, just the exhaustion of a man whose entire apparatus had been built on the premise that the ending he'd designed was the one that would occur, and the collapse of that premise had left nothing underneath it. His hands went behind his back and the restraints went on, and he was walked to one of the federal vehicles and the door closed. Knox watched the door close. He stood on the cold gravel at the base of the communications tower, with the red light blinking its patient rhythm above him and the federal activity organized efficiently around him, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and felt the swelling in his jaw and the split in his cheek and the cold moving through the jacket he was wearing, and all of it was real and solid and specific and here. Diesel came to stand beside him. They watched the federal vehicle together without speaking. After a while, Diesel said, "You good?" Not a question, the way he'd said it in other places, on other nights, after other things. "Yeah," Knox said. That was the whole of it, and it was sufficient. Trent Holloway was arrested at a gas station 12 miles south of Mercier at 6:40 in the morning, trying to put distance between himself and a county where the architecture of a 20-year operation had just collapsed overnight. He'd had 40 minutes of warning from someone inside the network and had used those 40 minutes poorly. The arresting officers found him in the convenience store attached to the gas station, buying coffee, as though the specific ordinary ritual of it might anchor him to a version of events where he still had options. He didn't have options. Knox learned this from Cage, who learned it from a scanner app and reported it with the brevity of a man who understood that certain information deserved acknowledgement but not ceremony. Holloway's in custody. Knox nodded. He filed it in the category of things that were done. The harder accounting happened in the hospital in Clarkson at 7 in the morning, in a corridor outside the room where Evelyn Hart was being evaluated for her shoulder and for the accumulated damage of weeks in that outbuilding. The dehydration, the weight loss, the bruising that Prophet had noted professionally and Knox had noted as something else entirely. Mara arrived with Lila at 7:15. Knox was standing in the corridor with a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold while he was thinking about other things. When the elevator opened and Cage came out first, and then Mara and then Lila, who was wearing the olive green coat with the safety pinned zipper and looking at Knox with those enormous dark eyes that had assessed him on the Widow Road and found him acceptable. She crossed the corridor without running. She didn't run. She walked, deliberately, the way she did everything, with the gravity of a child who had learned that the world required seriousness. And she stopped in front of him and looked up at him and said, "Is she here?" "She's here," Knox said. "She's going to be okay." Lila held his gaze, doing the calibration, finding the gap between what he said and what he meant, and measuring it the way she always did. This time, there was no gap. Something in her face changed, not dramatically, not the way a child's face changed in movies, with tears and release and the visible performance of relief. Just a small, specific relaxation of something that had been held contracted for a very long time. A loosening in the area around her eyes and jaw, a breath that went deeper than the ones before it. She reached into the collar of her borrowed sweatshirt, and her hand came out empty, and she looked at it, and then at Knox with a question she didn't quite ask. Knox reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the locket and held it out. "I told you I'd give it back," he said. She took it. She held it in both hands for a moment, closed, the way she'd held it on that first night on the Widow Road, when she'd been too cold and too frightened to open it. Then she clasped it around her own neck and tucked it inside the sweatshirt and pressed her palm flat against her chest above it. She looked at Knox. "Can I see her?" she said. "Yeah," Knox said. "Come on." He walked her down the corridor to the room and knocked once and opened the door and stood back. He didn't go in. That moment wasn't his. He stood in the doorway long enough to see Evelyn Hart look up from the hospital bed, her arm properly immobilized now, her face washed and the exhaustion sitting plainly in it, but under the exhaustion, something else, something that had been surviving on almost nothing for a long time, and was now, cautiously, beginning to believe it was allowed to do something other than survive. She saw Lila. Knox pulled the door closed. He stood in the corridor and drank his cold coffee and did not listen at the door, and the sounds that came through it anyway were not sounds he'd described to anyone. The days that followed were the slow, unglamorous work of aftermath, which was the part nobody made movies about. Statements given, lawyers sourced through Mara's network for Evelyn, who had her own legal complexities to untangle from Trent Holloway's world. Forms. Questions from federal agents who were professionally thorough and personally uninterested in the human texture of what had happened on a ridge in November. Wren, who spent 2 days in formal debriefing and came out of it looking like a man who had paid a bill he'd been carrying for a long time and was not sure the payment had covered everything, but had covered enough. He came to find Knox on the third day at the diner on Route 44 where Knox had taken to having his mornings, a booth in the back, bad coffee, and decent eggs, and the particular quality of early light through a diner window that turned everything amber and ordinary. Wren sat across from him without asking. Knox looked at him. Wren put both hands on the table, open, a gesture that was either habit or deliberate, and was probably both. He said, "I understand if this is the end of it." Knox drank his coffee. "The file you built on us," he said. "Where is it?" "Deleted," Wren said. "The moment Graves was in custody. I kept the operational documentation, Graves' network, his people, the corrupt officials. All of that is with the federal investigators. Everything on the Brotherhood is gone." "Can I verify that?" "No," Wren said. "You can't." He held Knox's gaze. "That's the actual situation." Knox sat with it. The thing about betrayal, the kind Wren had brought to the table, was that it didn't resolve cleanly. It didn't become something else because the person who'd done it had reasons, or because those reasons had some validity, or because the outcome had been better than it might have been. It stayed what it was. The question was only what you built on top of it, or whether you built anything at all. Knox thought about 18 months of a man eating at his table and riding at his back and being something Knox had taken for a brother. He thought about the south fence and the fatigued chain link, and Prophet's pick in the padlock, and Diesel's cut sleeve, and Cage with his permanent lean staying near a child so she wouldn't be alone. He thought about what it cost to be the kind of man who showed up on a frozen road for a child he didn't know. He thought it probably cost the same as the kind of man who spent 18 months documenting criminals and living under a false name and watching people he'd come to care about through the specific painful lens of someone who could not afford to say so. He didn't say any of this. He said, "There are 3 bikes sitting in the grain cooperative off Faro Creek. They need to be retrieved." Wren looked at him. "You know where it is," Knox said. "Take Cage, take the truck. Bring them home." A silence. Small and specific. "Okay," Wren said. That was all. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday that arrived cold and clear, with the particular sharp brightness of a November that had decided to be honest about itself, they gathered at the farmhouse. Not formally. There was no formal about any of them. No capacity for ceremony that didn't feel like something borrowed from a life they hadn't lived. They gathered the way they always gathered, which was by arriving when they arrived and finding coffee and finding a place to be and staying as long as staying made sense. Evelyn and Lila had been given the second-floor room, the one with the window that faced the ridge. It had been Diesel's idea, executed without discussion, the room cleaned and supplied before they arrived, a space heater sourced from the hardware store in Clarkson, installed against the wall in case the farmhouse furnace had opinions. Which it did. Lila had stood in the doorway of the room for a moment when she first saw it. Then she'd walked to the window and looked at the ridge. "We can stay here?" she'd said. "As long as you need," Diesel said from behind her. She'd turned and looked at him. He'd looked back at her with the steadiness he brought to everything, the full weight attention of a man who wasted nothing, and something in the exchange had required no further words. On the Saturday, 2 weeks later, Lila sat on the porch in the cold with the nature encyclopedia Mara had found at the used bookstore in Clarkson, and her boots on the porch railing and the locket outside her sweatshirt catching the thin winter sun. She was reading about migratory birds. She had questions about migratory birds that she asked whoever was nearby, with the specific relentlessness of a child who had recently discovered that asking questions was something she was allowed to do. Prophet was nearby. He answered all of them. He had the patience for it, the medic's patience, the kind that came from years of understanding that questions were how people oriented themselves in disorienting situations, and that the correct response to a question was an answer. Diesel was inside, fixing something in the kitchen that had needed fixing since the summer, the particular sound of a capable man with tools drifting through the porch screen door. Cage was in the barn. Knox could hear the Softail running, Cage tuning it, the engine note changing under his adjustments, rising and falling with the specific language of a machine being listened to carefully. Evelyn came out of the door behind Knox and stood beside him at the porch railing with a coffee cup in her good hand, the other arm still in a proper sling that she'd have for another 2 weeks. She looked out at the ridge. He looked at her. She'd been putting weight back on. Sleeping. The hospital look was fading, replaced by something more like herself, or what he imagined herself to be, since he was still constructing that picture from pieces, still learning the specific shape of a person he'd missed knowing for 19 years. She didn't say anything for a while. They stood in the cold and drank their coffee, and the ridge was dark green and gray in the winter light, and the sky above it was the pale clear blue of a cold system that had finally moved through and left something clean behind. "I want to say thank you," she said eventually. "You don't have to," Knox said. "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "That's why I want to." He nodded. She looked back at the ridge. Then she said quietly, "I never stopped believing you were real. After Memphis. People told me I'd imagined it, that no one just cuts a lock and walks away without wanting something back. I was young. I almost believed them." A breath. Almost. Knox looked at the ridge, at the pines, at the particular quality of winter light on things that had endured the cold long enough to stop being surprised by it. "Lila kept it," he said. "The photograph. All that time." "She never saw me doubt," Evelyn said. "I made sure of that." He He thought about what it had cost her to make sure of that. He thought it was probably the most expensive thing she'd ever done, and she'd done it every day for 8 years without acknowledgement or pause. He didn't say this, she knew it. From the porch, Lila looked up from her book and found Knox with her eyes, and said, without preamble, "Do you know why birds migrate south?" "Cold," Knox said. "That's part of it," Lila said, with the tone of a person who had done more thorough research. "But it's also because the food moves. They follow what they need." She looked back at the book. "They always come back, though, every year, same places." She said this as information, as a fact she'd found and assessed and decided was worth sharing. Knox looked at her on the porch in the cold, with her boots on the railing and the locket catching the winter sun and the encyclopedia open on her lap and the ridge behind her, and all of it, was real and present and his. From the barn, the Softail's engine note settled into its clean, steady idle. Cage had found what he was looking for. The machine was right. Knox drank his coffee, the cold pressed against his face and neck and hands, the committed November cold, honest and full weight. He didn't lean away from it. He'd been riding the Widow Road looking for nothing, for quiet, for the particular emptiness of a man who had convinced himself that the absence of things to lose was the same as peace. He'd spent years building that absence carefully, tending it, keeping it clear. Then a headlight caught a piece of chain. He looked at the ridge one more time, at the pines going dark green down to the creek bottom and back up to the sky, at the road coming down from the high country, visible for half a mile before it disappeared into the trees, the road that had brought him here from the Widow Road and would bring him back out again when it was time and would be there when he came back. He'd been wrong about empty roads. He understood that now. Empty roads didn't lead to peace. They led to the next road, and eventually to the place where the headlight caught something, and a person made a choice, and the choice made them. Some roads didn't lead to freedom. Some roads led to this, to a porch on a cold morning, and coffee, and a child reading about birds, and the sound of an engine tuned right, and people who had come through the worst of things together and were still standing in the same light. Knox put his hand in his jacket pocket, the pocket where the locket had been. Empty now, back where it belonged. He was exactly where he was supposed to be.